Contractually Bound explores the tantalizing and emotional journey of Alina Carter, a struggling journalist desperate to save her career, and Leo Blackwood, a billionaire tech genius whose brilliance is only matched by his reclusive, enigmatic nature. Through the lens of their tumultuous relationship, we navigate themes of vulnerability, ambition, and the transformative power of love. Alina Carter's career as a journalist is on the brink of collapse. After a failed expose and mounting financial pressure, she reluctantly agrees to a high-paying job as the personal assistant to the elusive tech billionaire Leo Blackwood. Known for his cutting-edge AI innovations, Leo has a reputation for being a cold, calculating workaholic who values efficiency over empathy. But Alina's desperation pushes her past the warnings and whispers of his impossible standards. From the first day, Alina is thrown into a whirlwind of demanding tasks, cryptic instructions, and Leo's relentless pursuit of perfection. The job is nothing like she expected, and neither is her boss. Beneath his cold demeanor lies a man haunted by secrets and driven by an almost obsessive need to control his world. The two clash often, their arguments as fiery as their growing attraction. Alina challenges Leo's authority, her sharp wit and determination pushing him in ways no one else has dared before. As the weeks turn into months, Alina discovers that Leo is not as detached as he seems. Glimpses of vulnerability peek through his stoic exterior, drawing her closer despite her better judgment. When she accidentally stumbles upon a hidden chapter of his life, a devastating betrayal from his past, Alina finds herself caught between her professional obligations and a blossoming connection she cannot deny. Their relationship intensifies and the lines between employer and employee blur. But when a tabloid leaks damaging information about Leo, all signs point to Alina as the source. Devastated and betrayed, Leo ends their professional and personal ties, leaving Alina to fight for her innocence. With her career and heart shattered, Alina uncovers the true culprit behind the leak and risks everything to prove her loyalty to Leo. In the end, they both realize that their connection runs deeper than contracts and career goals. Together, they face the challenges of love, vulnerability, and forgiveness, proving that sometimes the most binding agreements are the ones written on the heart. Chapter 1. The Job Offer. Alina Carter clutched her lukewarm coffee, staring at her bank statement as if sheer willpower could change the glaring negative balance. The bustling noise of the cafe around her barely registered as she scrolled through a list of job postings, each less appealing than the last. Freelance journalism had once felt like a dream come true, a chance to uncover truths and tell stories that mattered. Now it was a nightmare. Her last article, a bold exposé on corporate corruption, had not only flopped but had landed her on the radar of powerful enemies. Offers had dried up, her savings were gone, and the eviction notice on her apartment door was a ticking clock she couldn't ignore. The notification on her phone came as a surprise. Subject: Opportunity with Blackwood Enterprises. Her brows furrowed as she opened the email. Blackwood Enterprises was a name she'd heard whispered in awe and fear. The tech giant's reclusive founder, Leo Blackwood, was a modern-day legend. A genius who had revolutionized AI technology, he was also infamous for his no-nonsense approach and brutal expectations of his employees. Rumor had it he'd fired an entire division for failing to meet a deadline. The email was brief. Blackwood Enterprises seeks a highly organized and resourceful personal assistant to support Mr. Blackwood directly.
Competitive salary.
Confidentiality mandatory. Non-disclosure agreement required. Immediate start. Alina hesitated. She wasn't a personal assistant. She wasn't even sure she wanted to be one. But the salary mentioned in the fine print was staggering, enough to pay off her debts and give her a fresh start. Desperation drowned her pride. The next morning, she found herself in the sleek, towering skyscraper that housed Blackwood Enterprises. The receptionist barely looked up as she directed Alina to the top floor. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't like to be kept waiting," the receptionist warned, her tone clipped. Alina stepped into the elevator, nerves twisting in her stomach. By the time the doors opened, she felt like she was walking into a lion's den. The office was as intimidating as the man it belonged to, minimalistic, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. Leo Blackwood sat at a massive glass desk, his sharp features illuminated by the morning sun. He looked up as she entered, piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and commanding. "You're late." Alina stopped herself. There was no point in explaining that the receptionist had sent her to the wrong floor initially. Excuses wouldn't fly with a man like Leo Blackwood. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to the chair across from him. She complied, clutching her portfolio like a shield. Leo studied her in silence, his gaze unnervingly intense. Finally, he spoke. "You're overqualified for this position." Alina blinked, startled. "And yet," he continued, "you applied anyway. That tells me one of two things. You're either desperate or you're ambitious. Which is it?" Heat rose to her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Maybe a little of both. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed his face before disappearing. "Fair enough. Here's how this will work. My schedule is relentless, and my time is valuable. If you can keep up, you'll find the compensation more than adequate. If not, you'll be replaced." Alina's pride prickled at his bluntness, but she nodded. "I can keep up."
Good.
"Then we're done here. You'll receive a contract by the end of the day. Read it carefully. My expectations are non-negotiable." As she left the office, a mix of relief and trepidation washed over her. She had landed the job, but at what cost? What she didn't know was that this contract would be the beginning of the most challenging, exhilarating, and life-altering chapter of her life. Alina Carter's first official day at Blackwood Enterprises started at 6:30 a.m., an hour she hadn't seen willingly in years. Her phone blared with notifications, an updated schedule from Leo Blackwood's assistant software, reminders of meetings, and a cryptic message from Leo himself. "Be prepared." Prepared for what? She wondered as she hurriedly finished her coffee and slipped on her sharpest blazer. The text was vague, yet strangely intimidating. By the time she reached the office, Leo was already deep in work, seated at his desk with a tablet in one hand and a pen in the other. He didn't look up as she walked in. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite the tight knot in her stomach. "Morning," he replied curtly. Without glancing her way, he slid a thick folder across the desk. "First task, find discrepancy in this report and have a solution ready before my 9 a.m. meeting." Alina flipped open the folder, her eyes scanning rows of numbers and jargon. It was financial data, something she hadn't worked with in years. "This is more accounting than administrative," she ventured, hoping she didn't sound defensive. "I'm aware," he said, finally looking up. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "I need someone who can think, not just take notes. Can you handle it?" Her pride flared, but she kept her tone professional. "I can handle it." "Good," he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The hours flew by as Alina worked furiously, cross-referencing figures and drafting her analysis. When she finally presented her findings to Leo, he leaned back in his chair, reading her report with an inscrutable expression. "Not bad," he said finally. "You missed one point, but it's solid." "Where did I miss?" she asked, leaning forward, her curiosity outweighing her ego. He tapped the paper, his fingers brushing hers as he pointed to the error. The unexpected contact sent a jolt through her, and she quickly pulled her hand back, her cheeks flushing. Leo's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, his expression unreadable. Then he returned to his usual brisk tone. "Fix it before the meeting. And clear your afternoon. You'll be accompanying me to an event tonight." The event was a high-profile charity gala, a world far removed from Alina's usual reality. She wore the only cocktail dress she owned, a simple black number, and barely managed to pin her hair into something resembling elegance. Leo, on the other hand, looked effortlessly stunning in a tailored black suit, his sharp features even more striking under the soft glow of the ballroom lights. As they entered together, heads turned, and whispers followed them like a ripple through the crowd. "Stick close," he murmured, his hand briefly brushing the small of her back as he guided her through the throng of guests. Alina felt her heart quicken at the subtle touch, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was just another task, part of the job. Throughout the night, she watched as Leo effortlessly navigated the room, his charm disarming even the most skeptical of investors. But beneath his polished exterior, she could sense an undercurrent of tension, as if every word, every smile, was carefully calculated. "Do you ever relax?" she asked during a rare, quiet moment, sipping the glass of champagne he'd handed her. Leo arched a brow, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Not often. That's exhausting." "Success is exhausting," he countered, his gaze fixed on hers. "But it's worth it." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the bustling crowd around them seemed to fade. Later that evening, back in his penthouse office, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Alina had stayed late to finalize notes from the gala, her heels kicked off under the desk as she typed away. Leo appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his expression softer than she'd ever seen. "You're still here," he said, walking toward her. "I wanted to make sure everything was ready for tomorrow." "You've done more than enough," he said, his voice low. "You should go home." "I don't mind staying." He stepped closer, and the air between them shifted. "Alina," he said softly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar warmth. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. His usual stoic mask was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "You challenge me," he said, his gaze searching hers. "No one does that anymore." Alina's breath hitched. Maybe someone should. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. But when she didn't pull away, it deepened, the barriers between them crumbling with every passing second. His hands framed her face, his touch both gentle and possessive, while her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. The world outside the office ceased to exist, leaving only the two of them in the quiet, electric space they'd created. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Leo rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates things," he murmured, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Just a little," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that the complications were worth it. For the first time in years, Alina felt alive, connected to something, someone who saw her as more than just another cog in the machine. And for the first time, Leo Blackwood let himself feel something beyond the walls he'd built around his heart. The morning after their shared kiss, Alina Carter's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The events of the previous night felt like a vivid dream, but the memory of Leo Blackwood's touch and the intensity in his eyes were impossible to ignore. As she sat at her small kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee, she couldn't help but wonder what this meant for her job, and for her. She had signed a contract. A very binding one. With a sigh, she glanced at her phone, hoping for a message from Leo to clarify where they stood. But there was nothing. Just the standard meeting reminders and an updated schedule from Blackwood Enterprises' AI assistant. Her mind raced with questions. Was last night just a fleeting moment of weakness for him? Did he regret it? And, more importantly, could she continue working for him without crossing more lines? Her phone buzzed, and she nearly spilled her coffee in her rush to grab it. The message was from Leo. "My office. 8 a.m. sharp." The usual succinct tone offered no hints about what lay ahead. Alina glanced at the clock and realized she had only 30 minutes to get ready. When she arrived at the office, Leo was already seated at his desk, impeccably dressed as always. His tie was perfectly knotted, his expression unreadable. As she stepped inside, he gestured for her to close the door. "Morning," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Morning," he replied, leaning back in his chair. His blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his otherwise composed demeanor. "About last night," he began, his tone measured. "We need to talk." Alina swallowed hard. "I figured we would." Leo stood and walked around his desk, leaning against the edge as he crossed his arms. "What happened between us was unexpected. I don't regret it," he said, his voice softening. "But it does change things." Change things how? She asked, her heart pounding. He hesitated, then reached for a document on his desk and handed it to her. It was another contract, printed on Blackwood Enterprises, signature letterhead. Her stomach sank. "You're not firing me, are you?" "No," he said quickly. "This isn't a termination notice. It's an amendment to your existing agreement." Alina's brow furrowed as she scanned the document. The amendment outlined new clauses about professional boundaries, confidentiality, and a detailed policy on personal relationships between employees. At the bottom was a note specifying that the clauses had been reviewed and approved by the company's legal team. "You're formalizing this?" she asked, her tone incredulous. Leo gave a small, almost sheepish shrug. "I built my company by anticipating risks and controlling outcomes. This thing between us, whatever it is, has to be handled carefully. The last thing I want is for you, or me, to be subjected to office gossip or legal complications." Alina stared at him, torn between admiration for his meticulousness and frustration at his impersonal approach. "So, what happens if I don't sign this?" His jaw tightened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Then we stop whatever this is and go back to a strictly professional relationship." "I'll understand, if that's what you want." She studied him, her heart tugging in two directions. On one hand, she respected his need for structure and order. On the other, the sterile nature of the contract felt like a stark contrast to the raw, unguarded connection they'd shared the night before. "What about what you want?" she asked softly, setting the contract on the desk. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a sigh, he ran a hand through his hair, his composed facade cracking. "I want you to stay," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I won't force you into anything. You deserve to feel safe and respected in this arrangement, whatever form it takes." Alina's heart swelled at his words, the honesty in them cutting through her doubts. She picked up the pen he'd placed next to the contract, but paused before signing. "I'll agree to this," she said, meeting his gaze. "But only if you promise one thing." "What's that?" "No more hiding behind contracts or policies when it comes to us. If you have something to say, say it. No legal jargon. No business speak." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth.
Deal.
She signed the document, her hand steady despite the enormity of what she was committing to. When she looked up, she found Leo watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and tasks, but the tension between them lingered, unspoken yet palpable. By the time the office cleared out for the evening, Alina found herself alone in the break room, pouring a cup of tea to soothe her nerves. She didn't hear Leo enter until he spoke. "Long days?" She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He looked less like the untouchable billionaire CEO and more like a man who had spent the day wrestling with his own thoughts. "Something like that," she replied, offering a small smile. He crossed the room, his footsteps quiet on the tile floor. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice low. "For trusting me." She set her cup down, her pulse quickening as he stopped in front of her. "I think we both know this isn't just about trust," she said. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a moment, the space between them felt charged with unspoken words and unfulfilled promises. Then, as if some invisible thread pulled them together, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. This kiss was different from the night before, more deliberate, more certain. His lips moved against hers with a mixture of tenderness and urgency, as if he were trying to communicate everything he couldn't say aloud. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet of the break room. "This is going to be complicated," he murmured, a hint of a smile in his voice. Alina smiled back, her fingers tracing the edge of his jaw. "I think I can handle complicated." The days following Alina's decision to sign the amended contract were a whirlwind of professional intensity and personal tension. On the surface, things between her and Leo appeared unchanged. Their work dynamic remained sharp and efficient, marked by long hours and high expectations. But beneath the polished exterior of their interactions, a new undercurrent buzzed, a mix of anticipation and unspoken promises that neither seemed ready to confront outright. By midweek, Alina found herself juggling back-to-back meetings, endless calls, and an inbox that seemed to multiply by the hour. Yet despite the chaos, she couldn't shake the growing sense that there was more to Leo than the calculating, enigmatic persona he presented to the world. It was during one of their late-night work sessions that she finally caught a glimpse of the man behind the mask. The conference room was dimly lit, the glow of the city skyline spilling through the massive windows. Papers and empty coffee cups cluttered the table as Alina sorted through yet another stack of reports. Across from her, Leo sat scrolling through his tablet, his expression taut with concentration. She stole a glance at him, noting the tension in his jaw and the faint shadow of exhaustion under his eyes. It was rare to see him anything less than immaculate, but tonight he looked human. "Do you ever stop?" she asked, her voice breaking the quiet. Leo glanced up, his brows arching slightly. "Excuse me? You've been going non-stop since I started working here," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I've seen you handle billion-dollar deals, resolve crises, and charm entire boardrooms without breaking a sweat. But I haven't seen you take a single break." He smirked, setting his tablet aside. "That's because I don't take breaks. That's not healthy." He chuckled softly, the sound low and surprisingly warm. "Says the woman who's still here at 10 p.m. working on a project that isn't even hers." Alina shrugged, refusing to let him deflect. "Touché. But seriously, what keeps you going? Is it just the thrill of success? Or is there something more?" Leo's smirk faded, his expression growing thoughtful. For a moment, she thought he might brush her off with another clipped response, but then he surprised her. "My parents," he said quietly, his gaze shifting to the window. Alina tilted her head, intrigued. "Your parents?" He nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "They sacrificed everything to build a life for me. My father was a mechanic and my mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. They believed in hard work and ambition, values they instilled in me from a young age." She leaned forward, captivated by this rare glimpse into his past. "That's where you get your drive." "It's where I get my sense of responsibility," he corrected, his voice tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps.
They never got to see any of this.
He gestured vaguely around the room. "My company. My success. My life." Alina's chest tightened. "What happened to them?" "They died in a car accident when I was 20, he said, his tone flat but his eyes revealing the depth of his loss. "One moment, they were there. The next, they were gone."
She didn't know what to say.
The vulnerability in his voice was staggering, so unlike the confident, controlled man she had come to know. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. Leo nodded, his gaze distant. "I promised myself that their sacrifices wouldn't be in vain. That I'd build something lasting. Something meaningful. And you have," Alina said, her voice firm. "Blackwood Enterprises is incredible. You've changed lives, Leo." He met her gaze, his lips curving into a faint smile. "It's not enough." "What do you mean?" "There's always something more to achieve, another goal to chase," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But no matter how much I accomplish, it feels hollow." Alina hesitated, then reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Maybe it's because you're chasing the wrong things." He looked at her sharply, his eyes narrowing. "And what should I be chasing?" "Connection," she said simply. "Purpose beyond the next deal or the next milestone. Something that makes you feel alive." For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze locked on hers. Then, to her surprise, he stood and walked to the window, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You make it sound so easy," he said quietly. "It's not," she admitted. "But it's worth it." Later that night, as they packed up their things and prepared to leave, the air between them felt different, softer, more open. "Thank you," Leo said as they stepped into the elevator together. "For what?" "For reminding me that there's more to life than work." Alina smiled, her heart swelling at his words. "Anytime." When the elevator doors opened on the lobby, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. Are you free tomorrow night? Her pulse quickened. Why? There's a charity dinner I'm attending, he said, his tone casual, but his eyes revealing something deeper. I could use some company. She hesitated, then nodded. I'd love to. Good, he said, a rare smile curving his lips. I'll have my driver pick you up at 7. As she walked out into the cool night air, Alina couldn't help but feel that tonight had been a turning point, not just for Leo, but for them. She was beginning to see the man behind the billionaire's mask, and with every glimpse, she found herself falling deeper into a world she never expected. Alina had thought the intensity of her work at Blackwood Enterprises couldn't get any higher, but the charity dinner with Leo seemed to have shifted everything. Their relationship, if it could even be called that, was veering into uncharted territory. Professional boundaries blurred more with every passing day, leaving her walking a tightrope between ambition and the undeniable pull she felt toward him. Tonight was another late one, the office long since emptied of the bustling daytime staff. Leo had summoned her to his penthouse suite at the top of Blackwood Tower for what he called a preliminary strategy session. In truth, it felt more like an excuse to spend time alone together, but Alina wasn't complaining. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture, sleek lines, glass walls, and minimalist furniture that spoke of wealth and power. The view of the city skyline was breathtaking, the lights below twinkling like stars. But even that couldn't distract Alina from the man in front of her. Leo was seated on a plush gray sofa, his tie loosened and the top button of his crisp white shirt undone. He looked relaxed for once, though the intensity in his eyes as he studied her was as sharp as ever. I made coffee, he said, nodding toward the table where a steaming pot sat next to 2 mugs. Did you really, or did you have someone else make it for you? She teased, setting her laptop bag down and joining him on the sofa. He smirked. I pressed a button. That counts, doesn't it? Alina laughed softly, pouring herself a cup and taking a cautious sip. It was surprisingly good, smooth and rich, much like the man sitting beside her. She felt his eyes on her as she set the mug down, and when she glanced at him, she caught a flicker of something unspoken in his gaze. You've been quiet tonight, he said, his voice low. I've been busy, she replied, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd been distracted. By him, by the ever-growing tension between them, by the constant replay of their stolen moments in her mind. Leo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied her. You're holding back. From what? From saying what you're really thinking. Alina's heart raced. There it was again, that relentless ability of his to cut through her defenses with just a look, a word. She took a deep breath, deciding to take the plunge.
Fine.
I'm wondering where this is going.
Us.
Whatever this is. Leo's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something, uncertainty, maybe, or vulnerability in his eyes. I've been wondering the same thing, he admitted. That admission surprised her. For all his confidence and control, it was rare for Leo to admit doubt. It made her feel braver, bolder. And, she prompted, her voice steady despite the rapid thrum of her pulse. And I think we need to stop pretending this is purely professional, he said, his tone firm. Because it's not. Not anymore. Alina swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words still left her breathless.
So, what do we do about it?
Leo's gaze softened, and for a moment, he looked almost unsure, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. Then he reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. We figured out, he said. Together. The next few hours passed in a blur of work and quiet conversation, the tension between them no longer an undercurrent, but an undeniable presence in the room. As they reviewed financial reports and brainstormed strategies for an upcoming deal, their hands brushed more often than necessary, and their shared glances lingered just a second too long. By the time the clock struck midnight, the work was finished, but neither of them made a move to leave. Alina set her laptop aside and leaned back against the sofa, exhaustion mingling with a strange sense of contentment. Do you ever miss the simplicity of your old life? She asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Leo tilted his head, considering her question. Sometimes, he admitted. But I don't think I'd know what to do with simplicity anymore. I've been chasing success for so long. It's become who I am. Maybe it's time to figure out who you are outside of work, she said softly. He looked at her, his gaze piercing. And what about you? Who are you outside of this job? Alina hesitated. It was a question she hadn't given much thought to lately. Her life had become so consumed by her work with Leo that everything else felt like a distant memory. I'm still trying to figure that out, she admitted. Leo leaned closer, his hand brushing against hers. Maybe we can figure it out together. The words were barely out of his mouth before the space between them disappeared. His lips found hers with a mix of urgency and tenderness, the kiss a culmination of weeks of tension and unspoken desire. Alina's breath hitched as she sank into him, her hands tangling in his shirt as he pulled her closer. The world outside the penthouse ceased to exist. There was only Leo. The way he kissed her like she was the only thing that mattered, the way his hands moved with a reverence that sent shivers down her spine. It was a heady, intoxicating mix of passion and vulnerability, and Alina found herself losing track of time, of space, of everything but him. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling in the quiet of the room, Leo rested his forehead against hers, a soft smile playing at his lips. This is going to complicate everything, isn't it? Alina laughed breathlessly. Probably, he chuckled, his thumb brushing against her cheek. I'm willing to take that risk if you are. She smiled, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. I am. And just like that, the lines between them blurred beyond recognition, leaving Alina and Leo standing at the start of something both terrifying and exhilarating. The days following that night in Leo's penthouse felt surreal. For the first time since she started working at Blackwood Enterprises, Alina found herself stepping into uncharted emotional territory. Her relationship with Leo, no longer confined by professionalism, felt exhilarating and dangerous all at once. They were careful to maintain appearances in the office. No lingering glances during meetings, no stolen moments in the hallways. But when the workday ended and the rest of the staff filtered out of the building, the boundaries that separated them crumbled. Late nights in his office turned into intimate conversations, shared laughter, and moments of vulnerability that made Alina feel closer to him than she ever thought possible. But even as their connection deepened, a nagging question lingered in the back of her mind. How much did she really know about Leo Blackwood? It was during one such late night that Alina decided to broach the subject. They were in his office, the city skyline glowing behind him as he reviewed a series of proposals for an upcoming product launch. Alina sat across from him, her laptop open but long since abandoned as she watched him work. Leo, she said softly, drawing his attention. He looked up, his sharp blue eyes softening as they met hers. Can I ask you something? His lips twitched in a faint smile. You usually do. This is different. She hesitated, then forged ahead. You've told me bits and pieces about your life, your parents, your drive to succeed, but there's so much I don't know. About your past, your personal life. Leo's smile faded, his expression growing guarded. What do you want to know? She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Anything. Everything. I want to understand you better. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze dropping to the papers in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. My past isn't exactly something I talk about often, he said. It's not pretty. Neither is mine, Alina said gently. But it's part of who we are. And if we're going to do this, whatever this is, I think we owe it to each other to be honest. Leo leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning her face, as if searching for something. Whatever he saw seemed to convince him, because he let out a soft sigh and nodded.
All right, he said.
Where do you want me to start? Over the next hour, Leo shared pieces of his life that he had long kept hidden. He told her about growing up in a working-class neighborhood, where opportunities were scarce and the pressure to survive often outweighed the dreams of something more. My father was a good man, he said, his voice tinged with both pride and sadness. He worked hard, did everything he could to provide for us. But he also had a temper. When things went wrong, when the bills piled up or the car broke down, He'd take it out on anyone in his path. Alina's heart ached at the pain in his voice, but she didn't interrupt, sensing that he needed to let it out. My mom bore the brunt of it, he continued. She'd shield me as much as she could, but there were times when even she couldn't stop him. I think that's why I became so obsessed with control. Growing up in chaos, it does something to you. It makes you want to build walls, Alina said softly. Leo nodded. Exactly. And I built them high. After my parents died, I threw myself into my studies, my work. I didn't let anyone in. Not friends, not relationships. It was easier that way. But it was lonely, she said, her chest tightening at the thought of him carrying so much weight on his own. It was, he admitted. But it was safe. Or at least it felt that way. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his gaze steady and unguarded. Now, I'm starting to think that maybe safety isn't worth the cost. As the night wore on, Alina found herself opening up in return. She told Leo about her own struggles, the failed journalism career that had left her questioning her worth, the financial troubles that had driven her to take a job she once would have scoffed at, and the deep-seated fear that she would never be enough. Sometimes I feel like I'm faking it, she admitted, her voice trembling. Like I'm just one step away from everything falling apart. Leo reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. You're not faking it, he said firmly. You're one of the smartest, most capable people I've ever met. And if you're ever in danger of falling, I'll be there to catch you. His words sent a warmth spreading through her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she believed them. The next morning, as Alina arrived at the office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their conversation had brought them closer, but it had also reminded her of why she had taken this job in the first place. She wasn't just there to support Leo. She was there to prove something to herself. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that their newfound closeness had not gone unnoticed. Miss Carter, said a voice behind her as she walked through the hallway. She turned to find Grace, the company's head of HR, watching her with a curious expression. Yes, Alina replied, forcing a polite smile. I'd like to speak with you in my office, Grace said, her tone neutral but firm. Alina's stomach dropped. She followed Grace to the small, impeccably organized office and took a seat across from her desk. I'll get straight to the point, Grace said, folding her hands. There's been some concern about your relationship with Mr. Blackwood. Alina's heart pounded. Concern? People have noticed that you've been spending a lot of time together, Grace said. Late nights in his office, accompanying him to events. You're a valuable employee, Alina, but I need to remind you that workplace relationships, particularly those involving a power dynamic, can be complicated. Alina's mind raced. She had been so focused on navigating her feelings for Leo that she hadn't considered how their relationship might appear to others. Of course, she said, keeping her tone even. I understand the concern, but I can assure you that my work has not been affected. Grace studied her for a moment, then nodded. I hope you're right. For your sake, and his. As Alina left the office, her thoughts were a jumbled mess. She knew she and Leo would need to address this sooner rather than later. Because no matter how deep their connection ran, the world around them wouldn't turn a blind eye forever. And the secrets they had shared in the safety of late nights and coffee breaks were now at risk of being exposed.